Welcome back to Anxious Faith. I'm your host, James Burke. One of the common threads through every story we've shared on Anxious Faith so far is that they're from people probably in the first half of their life. With the exception of a few, most of the people we've interviewed are between the ages of 20 and 40. And it seems to be a natural place to look for stories of mental health challenges, right? After all, we're the age group that seem to be dealing with them, or at least talking about them the most. But would it surprise you to know that some of the biggest sufferers of mental health challenges are people aged over 65? Conversations around rising mental health challenges usually focus on the statistics around working age adults and leave out a huge percentage of our population. Older people, it turns out, have got it just as bad or if not worse than us young'uns. So today we're talking with Ben, an aged care chaplain here in Australia who meets with people in care homes every day and sees the shockingly high number of those who are dealing with a mental health challenge. Most of us would know someone in the latter stages of their life, whether that might be a parent or a grandparent or even one of those nice old people from church that we don't see around anymore. Through today's chat with Ben, we want to learn more about what mental ill health looks like for the older members of our society and what we as individuals and the broader church can be doing better to love, care and support them. So let's hear from Ben. So Ben, thank you so much for joining us today. Why don't you start by telling us a bit about yourself?
James, thank you for having me to start with. It's great to be here on Anxious Faith. So I've been an aged care chaplain for about 15 years now. I've done some further studies in that space, and I actually do a little bit of lecturing in terms of aged care, spirituality, and care, as well as a bit of writing and stuff in that space too. Initially working in New South Wales, now up in Queensland, and was also part of the COVID response team to aged care down in Melbourne. So primarily Eastern Seaboard, but a bit of experience there.
Yeah, well, I mean, that is, 80% of our population here in Australia, Eastern Seaboard. So you've had a fair bit of experience and seen a fair bit as you've gone around. What does a normal day look like for you as an aged care chaplain?
Normal's not a great. Normal's complicated in aged care.
Fair.
There are some things that I would like to do on a normal day. So normally I'd get in, check my email, do that. I'd do at least 2 walks around the building during the day. So that's about as normal as it gets. Some days if I'm running church or I've got an activity on, that's really planned and normal in that sense.
Yep.
But I may be doing either something that's planned but not normal, so a funeral. So I do a fair amount of those, or running something or catching up with volunteers. But I can also come in. I can come in knowing someone's been sick, but it's quite normal for me to come in and, Mary's having a bad day. There's an issue there, or multiple people struggling, and that's not just staff, or not just residents, but also staff as well.
Yeah. Okay.
So and families for that matter. So it's plan hard and roll with the punches in a nice sort of way.
Yeah, absolutely. And real actual frontline ministry then as well. It's dealing with people in their everyday, in their day to day, and often in some of their not greatest days as well.
Yeah, I think it is full-time ministry, and both in that it is full-time. I think the big difference between what I do and my peers who are in the local church congregation is really who you're engaging with. Now, I don't simply mean that most of the people I deal with who are older, surprise, surprise, aged care, but most of the people I deal with, 80+% of the people I deal with, would not identify as Christians, would not identify as people of faith. Whereas when I talk to my peers in local church ministry, it's closer to 5 to 10% who are dealing with non-Christians. Whereas, most aged care chaplains work in a team, in a facility sense, that is primarily non-Christian. And most resident population in terms of Christianity is probably hard to tell, probably 20 to 30%.
Okay.
Would identify as Christian, again, broad brushstrokes Christian there.
Yeah.
But most of the staff are not, and most of the families are not. And again, that's one of the great privileges of aged care ministry. Lots of people who would shudder to go into a church and would say, "Oh, I couldn't go to church. God will strike me down." Never quite sure why they think He can't strike them down outside the church, but that's beside the point.
That's it.
Um, are my bread and butter in terms of my normal day-to-day interactions with. And I guess you said I'm dealing with people who are, at least older people, who are dealing with the hardest times in their life, whether that's mental health, whether that's other non-mental health issues, grief, loss, loneliness. Those are just normal.
It's really interesting that you talk about how, older people dealing with not just their mental health, but their, physical health and emotional health as well. Because I think sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking about mental health and we hear the stats and it's always about, adults age, 18 to 65. And so we kind of bandy around the stats of how many people are dealing with it or something, how many people might face something in their lifetime. But that is leaving out a huge percentage of the population and, increasingly one of the largest percentages of the population, as we have an aging population here in Australia. What's, are you happy to go into a bit about what some of the mental health challenges are and struggles are that you come across in your day-to-day work?
Yeah. Look, as a chaplain, I deal with people who are facing a range of mental health challenges. One of the peculiarities, I deal with a fair amount of child abuse stuff, often because older people who were not able to process it at a younger age are now trying to process something when you're 85. Now, it may have happened when you were 10.
Yeah.
So you've got all that stuff that we don't necessarily think of. When people say older people, they think, oh, well, you don't have to deal with child abuse. But it's actually relatively common in my world. So there's that stuff. I did a bit of Googling in the preparation of this, so I sound more intelligent than I am. But yeah, look, I looked at the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. They were talking about 68% of people on a particular date in aged care were looking for a depression diagnosis.
Wow.
68%.
Wow.
That's pretty high. I did some working again in preparation for this, looking at that within a dementia and depression. And I saw stats between 25 and 80%. Now, part of that huge range, around 25% is horrible, 80% is terrifying.
Yeah, what do we even do with that? Yeah.
And part of the issue is, as always with mental health, lack of diagnoses. And that doesn't just apply to older people, of course. But you've also got things like grief can look a bit like depression, and depression can look like grief. And almost all the older people I deal with, all the older people, I would almost say, in a residential care facility in Australia, are facing all 7 of the major losses. So the loss of your home, the loss of your community, typically the loss of spouse, all of those things. So there's a whole pile of low-level loneliness, for want of a better phrase, or not low-level, but background loneliness on top of clinical issues. Depression is huge. And again, that tie-in between dementia and depression is messy too. And a lot of the symptoms of depression can look like dementia, and dementia can look like depression. So even teasing those things apart and treating the appropriate symptom and or disease process is really messy. Again, I looked at some of the stats for anxiety. We're talking between 20% and 60% of people in aged care requiring treatment for anxiety. So yeah, if we say 80% of people living with dementia, 68% of people in aged care with dementia, living with depression. One of the things I was surprised about, I used to say, and until I was reading this, or doing my research for this, that the older male is the second highest percentage of people, or risk factor for people dying from suicide. The stats I found in preparing for this say that no, I was wrong. It's 75. The 75-year-old male, or 75-plus-year-old male, is the group or the demographic most likely to commit suicide.
Yeah.
And older men, or men in general, but particularly older men, are more likely to be successful in that.
Mm.
So it's huge is probably the starting point of that conversation.
Yeah, that's it. And really harrowing stats as well. If we, we thought it was bad if it was, like you say, 25% is bad enough, let alone if it's 80%, that it almost elicits that kind of shock reaction of going, how do I even comprehend that many
Yeah.
people are dealing with this on a day-to-day basis? Which is why the need for mental health care across the board, not just for the elderly, not just for people still in their youth or younger years, is required. But obviously, like as you say, there's things that have gone on in people's lives that they have just never dealt with or never perhaps had the time or the space or the willingness to delve into, and now find these things coming up for them. And so it's not just a recent occurrence that might be coming up, but previous traumas or previous experiences that are coming back as well.
And that's part of it too, in that some people, for a number of these, if the percentages are right, a number of these people haven't experienced depression or anxiety or mental health earlier in life. Now, some people, I mean, myself included, live with depression, and that's just part of the course. And that's something I've lived with for decades, and I suspect I will be living with for decades. So there are some older people who are living with mental health issues. And of course, you've got the full range of other mental health issues. Mental health is much bigger than simply anxiety and depression and suicidal ideation, if that's a diagnosis these days.
Yeah.
You've got people living with bipolar, you've got people living with schizophrenia, you've got people living with all kinds of issues that often start in our teenage years or earlier in life. Older, I'm going to call for today's episode 65 plus.
Yep.
Messy to define. But so you've got a whole bunch of people who have long-standing mental health challenges, if that's the right language. But you've also got people who've only had either intermittent or almost no experience of mental health, struggling with it when they have lower support systems than they've ever had in their lives, and facing more challenges, social, emotional, psychological, let alone spiritual. So it's a tough space.
Let's talk about suicide for a second, if you're happy to. It's a difficult thing to talk about often, but interestingly, it's something that I think we look at with an entirely different lens when the person is, say, perhaps aged over 75 or 80. And as you're saying that, Australian men aged 75 and over are the demographic most likely to actually die by suicide. I didn't realize that it was that high, and that was the most endangered group, so to speak. But B, is there a different approach with suicide with people in that age?
Broad brushstrokes, no. It's much of a muchness. Much of what you would do in a standard mental health course, mental health first aid course, is boringly applicable across the demographic, across genders. Now, there are much like genders or other ages. There are some differences, but they are broad brushstrokes. No, they're not. It's exactly the same process and principles that you would pick up in any mental health training. There are some peculiarities, and if people wanted training, there's a mental health first aid course for older people. You can specifically pick that up. So if you're interested in this space acutely, there is some training, and again, that's much more than I can cover in this space instantly.
Is it something that we perhaps dismiss with people that might be in this age group?
I think we dismiss and almost expect it. Now, expect it sounds weird, having said that we've just had a conversation where we said mental health in older people. Hang on a minute, does that really happen? But we have, in a number of states now in Australia, voluntary euthanasia, which is primarily for older people. And I still can't quite get my small head around how is it okay if a 16-year-old says I'm suicidal, it's panic stations. But when an older person says they're suicidal, they want to die, oh, here's the brochure for VAD. Um, should that not bother us somewhat?
Mm,
Um,
mm,
Again, I think it ties into a societal, and I think it's contaminated the church to ageism. That that being older is a pointless, worthless exercise because your value is derived from your beauty, your power, your economic contribution. And older people, well, they're just a drain on the economy. They're grey tsunami. I'm not going to say some of the other things I've heard over time.
Is it almost like we think, well, they've had their life, they've had their opportunity to do these things, so yeah, I can get why they're saying I've had enough now, and perhaps miss some of those warning signs.
Yeah, I think we can miss warning signs. I think we can also. There's been some interesting studies done by Elizabeth McKinley, who was at Canberra and is one of the world experts in the space, saying that most people who are most people who are older think about residential care as, dear Lord, I'd prefer to be dead.
Mm,
My words, not hers. Um, but most people living in residential care are comparatively doing pretty well and are
mm,
happy to be alive. So I think we have some projection of our own fears
mm,
into being older, into facing those challenges, and we think, oh, crumbs, I don't know how I would possibly deal with it. Oh, they're not dealing with it. Oh, well, that's okay.
mm,
I think there's also, Australia and I think the Western world largely has done a really good job of highlighting youth suicide.
mm.
Um, and we're to be commended for that. That's a
Yeah.
great thing. But I think the next big step, and I'm biased, I know, is to say, hang on, well, what's the highest demographic? Oh, maybe older people. Well, maybe
Mm,
older men need some TLC in this space.
yeah.
And blokes in particular, I think, struggle with lack of connection. We're not necessarily really great at catching up with friends and maintaining and
Yeah.
investing in those relationships. So that's huge.
Mm,
Um, but yeah, I don't think we think about aged care enough or older people and suicide. It's very easy, and I've seen it even with staff who should know better,
mm,
uh, who said, "Oh, well, yeah, they're miserable again." Well, um, and look, some older people. I mean, I think some people, in fact, all of us have moments where we moan about life.
mm.
Oh,
Yeah,
life's tough
absolutely.
today. Oh, I'm recovering from a cold. Oh, I've got COVID. Oh,
Mm,
there is some there is space, and indeed, I think probably some healthiness in saying, "Dear Lord, it's hard at the moment."
mm,
Now, I think as Christians, we really need to be taking that to lament, as opposed to just moaning about stuff.
mm,
Um, but there is also, the stats are huge. Suicide is a really big issue. Um, yeah, and again, older men like younger men are pretty good at being successful in suicide too, which doesn't
mm.
help us in
Yeah.
this space. So we need to treat this seriously. We need to question, do we care? If we don't, why don't we? Now, there's some things we may not need to care about. That's okay. I'm never going to run a podcast, so I don't need to know about how to run a podcast. But I know the stats for mental health in the community, so if I'm a Christian, I think it's pretty sensible for me to get some basic mental health first aid course training, whether
Mm,
that's a mental health first aid course. If you're doing a seniors ministry, do the seniors mental health or the older person's mental health training. Engage with sanctuary mental health. Beyond Blue has stuff. There is
mm,
piles of resources out there. But when I was growing up, it was pretty standard to do a first aid certificate.
mm.
So at least, and mine's lapsed, and now I work with nurses, so I just say nurse. Um, um, but I've got some. Am I a nurse? Am I a surgeon? Unequivocally not. But if someone falls over and cuts themselves, I've got a basic idea of apply pressure, elevate the limb, call the ambulance.
Mm,
Um, None of that stuff is rocket science.
Yeah.
And we need to, or I think we need to have that same awareness in terms of mental health. And the
Mm.
skills we apply with older people will apply to younger people and vice versa. They're not profoundly different demographics. They're
Mm.
all people.
Yeah.
They all need they they all need us to love them.
Yeah, that's it. And you can, putting yourself in their shoes for a second, you can understand when, yeah, if you're going through some of those major losses of, losing your community, losing your house, perhaps have lost a spouse or something like that. You're somewhere new, you're in a new routine, everything like that, where everything is different. No wonder that is going to be a stressful time and experience, that is going to be something that's hard to deal with, and you might struggle with, let alone everything else that might be going on as well. Do you find that there is uh, a kind of fair amount of people that do or don't come in already with a diagnosis versus find themselves dealing with one after moving into residential care?
That's a hard question to answer, and I don't know that I know it well enough to make anything.
Yeah.
We definitely have some. It's not uncommon for me to have James is coming in next week, and we'll know that James is coming in, and someone else will pull me aside and say, "Oh, look, James has a history of manic depression, or James has a history of schizophrenia. Really, this is going to be a tough space for him. Can you provide a bit of TLC?"
Yeah.
So that's not uncommon. But as to actual percentages, I don't know, and my suspicion is that most people don't know,
Mm.
or I don't know of anyone who would even have the stats, government or otherwise.
Yeah. No, that's fair enough. So then, if all these people are there, they're dealing with these very complex things that are going on. Your role is to, yeah, perhaps be someone that can offer them some TLC. What does that actually look like in your role? How do you, as a chaplain, actually come alongside people that might be dealing with these things?
Yeah, it's a good question, James. Um, the start for me is basic. It's ministry, so it doesn't change. I don't think whether it's young people or older people. So it generally starts with relationship. So in
Mm.
the first 24, 48 hours, I'm trying to be there at least to have had a 2 second, hello, I'm the chaplain. Now, first 24 hours in aged care, you've got all the shock and trauma of change, plus everybody's coming to do this paperwork and that paperwork and a zillion things that are really important, but can be quite overwhelming. So, yeah, first 24, 48 hours, I'm trying to at least stick my head in the door, if that makes sense.
Mm. Yeah.
Typically a short visit. Again, if someone wants to talk, I'm happy to, but I'm not aiming at anything particularly deep. Within the first week or two, um, I'm aiming to have had a decent conversation with them. Um, my theory on chaplaincy, in fact, I think it's basically my theory on ministry, is that if I'm meeting you in your space, I'll talk about whatever you want to talk about. So if you want to talk about Fergie tractors or geraniums, we'll talk about Fergies or geraniums. Um, at the same time, I'm running church each week, and I'm going to be inviting people to that. And or we'll have seasonal events like Shrove Tuesday, which has just passed. We've got St Patrick's Day coming up, which are, from my perspective, a great opportunity to talk about Jesus. So if
Mm.
I'm in your room, you get sent the agenda. If you come to an event, Jesus is going to be pretty front and center. I'm pretty open that I'm the chaplain,
Mm.
and therefore people know that I'm going to talk about God, but
Yeah.
I'm not there to beat people up about God. Um, I'm there to be available. And then it just depends on what the person wants and
Mm.
needs and where they're at, and trying my best to meet the needs that they're facing.
Yeah, and the reality is what you're doing is not something that is necessarily so far different from what we all should be doing as followers of Christ in being a good neighbor for someone. It's building that relationship. It's being willing to be in their space and get to know them and eventually introducing them to Jesus and making that part of the conversation as well.
Yeah,
And this is why, it's really fascinating and why we wanted to talk to you as well, because it can be often something like this can be very hard sometimes to wrap our head around. What can we do? If we're going to hear stats like up to 80% of people are dealing with some form of it. Uh, what do? I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a counsellor, so I can't really do anything about that. But from what you're saying, your approach is not, and I'm not in any way trying to diminish your work, but it's not like some.
I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a counsellor. Now, I probably have some skills that are not normal. And I definitely have more training than the average bear, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, look, most older people, and particularly most older people living with mental health challenges, if that's our demographic for this term, don't primarily need a psychologist. Now, I'm a big fan of psychology and counselling and etc. etc. I'm not trying to diminish that in any sense. The major need is a friend or friends. Again, most of us in today's world are pretty busy. I'm sure James is too. But if you sleep for, say, we'll call it 10 hours of sleeping, and then you have another 5 hours of bathroom and kitchen, for want of a better phrase, so eating and personal cares.
Yep.
That's 15 hours. How many hours are there in a day?
24.
24, 15 to 24, that's 9 hours. What are you going to fill with that with? You're not going to work, at least in a paid sense of work. There's not that much great TV on.
Yeah.
Even if you go to, most facilities would have morning and afternoon activities that run for an hour or so. What do you do? And some of those activities are going to be up your alley, and some of them are going to be, dear Lord, if they ever ask me to bingo again, I'm going to scream. So there are those real challenges of how do you fill that time effectively? How do you live without? Well, let me put it over a different way. Most older people live largely without compassionate touch, and I don't mean that carers are not compassionate, but there's a big difference between someone showering you and someone giving you a hug because they love you. That's huge. So all of that makes it hard. In terms of what we can do in the, I'll use the phrase normal Christian. I just don't have a better.
I just want to go back to something you said earlier, which I think took me a little bit by surprise, was talking about dementia in this space with mental health, because it's not often something we usually think about. We think of it as perhaps something that, yes, is related to elderly people, something they struggle with and deal with, but don't necessarily think about it as a mental health struggle. And yet, as you're saying, like there's so many similarities, or maybe even hard to distinguish the difference between depression and dementia and things like that. Is that something that comes up a fair bit in your work and in your context of your work, about how much or how prevalent dementia is?
Yeah, dementia is probably the illness I deal with most, or the diseases I deal with most. I think the stats in residential care last I heard were about 80% of people living in care homes or residential care, if you're in Australia, are living with some level of cognitive impairment. So I'm going to assume everybody knows nothing about dementia and just give you the very quick super summary. So dementia is a bit like cancer. It's an umbrella term for a whole range of different disease processes. The most common, of course, is Alzheimer's. But there are 200 plus, last I checked, different diseases.
Oh, wow.
And part of that there is that so dementia affects the brain, surprise, surprise.
Yep.
It affects everything the brain controls. So it's much more than memory loss. It can affect how you see things. It can affect your spatial awareness and your ability to navigate. It affects everything. It's also progressive, so it gets worse over time, and terminal. Dementia will kill you if something else doesn't first, if you have it. So it's a pretty scary and a pretty big topic. Now, much like cancer, it depends on what sort of cancer, how your disease will progress over time.
Yeah.
But also, again, like cancer, some people beat the odds or at least slow it down. And you hear of stories of someone who was given 3 months and 3 years later they're still with us.
Yep.
So it's really messy to try and work out what's going on. And part of that too is that a lot of the dementias are diagnosed primarily through brain dissection, and we can't actually dissect your brain while you're alive. Minor detail, I know.
Yep.
So dementia is huge, and it's not. That's all the sort of biomedical stuff around dementia. Perhaps one of the biggest issues with dementia is actually the social implication. Now,
Okay.
yes, dementia can make it hard for people to communicate, or people living with dementia to communicate with other people. Look, at Christmas I had my dad not recognise me. That's really emotionally strenuous for me.
Yeah.
But perhaps the bigger challenge for many people living with dementia is that their social support, the people they've known for years, suddenly vanish. People say, "Oh, they won't know me, so I won't visit," or "I'm not sure what to say," or "It's scary visiting them in the care home," particularly older people. Going to the care home is terrifying because they might lock me in. So there's all of that stuff, but which is real and scary. But much like mental health, simply turning up is huge, and we don't get that right a lot of the time, to be ruthlessly honest.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. We've talked so many times before and heard so many people share as part of their stories about once they were able to find some form of community, once they were able to be open with people around them in their mental health journey and they weren't so isolated, that's when they were able to start making more progress or quicker, further progress in their mental health recovery. That importance of community and people around you is so important for every aspect of life as humans. We're designed to be relational beings. So
Yep.
yeah, that's you can understand exactly how much that could play into these things and just make it so difficult for someone.
Yeah, it just adds to the burden. It just makes it harder. Again, I'm doing some research at the moment on quality of life in later people or in older people.
Mm.
And the one thing that every single paper is saying is relationship connection is critical for well-being, for quality of life in later life. And again, we should, as Christians, we shouldn't be at all surprised. We are created as relational beings. Ooh, older people are actually people.
Yeah.
Whoa, shock horror.
That's it. The elderly are people as well. And that I think is sometimes something we sadly, and I'm the first to admit that I will put my hand up and say I'm guilty of this, tend to forget about them to some degree, write them off because they're not there in front of us. We don't see them as often, those kind of things. So we don't think of their needs as people as much as we would say the people we see at work, our family members, our friends, our colleagues, our people at church, that kind of stuff.
Yep.
And that's one of the reasons why I want to have this conversation where we've been speaking to, people in their, teens, 20s, 30s, 40s about their mental health. But, the reality is so many older people are dealing with it. But you may be sitting there going, well, but I'm not an older person, so why do I need to know about this? But that's exactly what you're saying. They are our brothers and sisters in Christ. They are still people. They are still relational beings. And as Christians, we should be looking to try and look at how we can love our neighbors as ourselves, as we've been commanded to. So I want to spend a bit of time talking about perhaps, what we can be doing or what we could be doing to help people that might be in this kind of stage of life and dealing with mental health challenges in their elderly years. Because we're not going to be speaking to ourselves, and this is not stuff that we need to learn to manage our own mental health, but most people will have family members who are getting into this stage of life, whether that's parents or grandparents or people at their church that they might have known, neighbors, any of these kind of connections. If you think about it, you will probably know people that are in this stage of life. And if the percentages are so high, then we can all learn something about how we could be actually serving them better as people, loving them better, and hopefully helping them through some of these difficult times. So, Ben, you're the perfect person to talk to about this. You know, you're there kind of doing some of this on a day-to-day basis. So what can we as people and can we as Christians be doing, individually to help care for people that are elderly and might be dealing with mental health challenges?
I think it starts with awareness as people. One of the big issues, and it's not limited to mental health, but for older people generally, is ageism. So discrimination against older people on the basis of age. Now that's a whole other episode, and I'm going to leave it alone. Other than to say that, much like mental health, there is a huge stigma, or there's often a huge stigma in terms of society and how older people are treated and valued or not valued. If we move that into the Christian frame for a moment, you mentioned before, love your neighbour as yourself, but I think there's actually some other biblical commandments that actually tighten that. If you go through the Old Testament, it regularly, and the New to a lesser extent, but repeatedly says, care for widows and orphans.
Yeah.
Now, not all widows in a biblical sense would have been older in our sense of the word. But the older you are, the higher the probability of you being a widow or widower. And I think the other commandment that ties in there too is from the Ten Commandments, that whole honour your parents. Now, I think that does primarily apply to our biological parents, but I think it's broader than that. And I think often as Christians, we sort of treat that as, oh, well, that's something for the teenagers. 16-year-old, you should honour me a bit. But we don't time limit, if that's right, or age limit any of the other commandments. In fact, adultery and murder are probably primarily adult sins as opposed to children's sins. At least we hope so. So it's not simply love your neighbour as yourself. There's a broader specificity, if I can. It's not great English, but you'll cope. In Scripture, saying that we need to be actively caring for older people, and I would be suggesting that if we don't have anybody older in our life, what's going on there? Is that, I don't want to say that everybody is guilty of not caring for older people if you don't know an older person. But I do want to say, well, hang on a minute, why don't you know anybody who's older? Now, there's a whole pile of cultural things, and I think as a society we've been very good at demigrating or dividing people into kids' church, young adults, youth group, and our churches do that too, to some extent, as a reflection of society.
Yep.
But if we don't know anybody who's older, then I would suggest that we need to be considering who we could meet and how we might provide care for older people. And given those stats, 68%, 80%, the chances are, if you know two older people, you know at least one older person who's living with mental health.
That's it, yeah. So what can we do to help these people or to care and love for these people?
I think it starts with that, actually caring enough to notice. There's a bloke who lives down the road. There's a woman who lives across the hall. Just stop and, yeah, you're busy, I'm busy, we're all busy. Considering, look, is there a congregation at my church that maybe the early morning congregation, for the old people, could I possibly consider going there once a month as opposed to doing church there? So it starts with awareness. I've just got a draft or a manuscript in with the publishers in Scotland, and the three P's is the model I'm using there, which is pray, presence, and pastoral care. And I think that's a good way of looking at ministry generally, and for mental health particularly. Not alone just mental health or mental health in amongst older people and people living with dementia. Prayer is what powers what we do. Ultimately, we're not the strong ones. We don't make salvation. We don't bring people to salvation. We don't do squat. We are dead in our transgressions.
Yep.
It's God who's the powerful one.
Mm.
So I think if you're a Christian, you should be able to pray. If not, there's got some great resources out there.
Mm.
So pray about older people.
Mm.
Pray for opportunities to meet older people, perhaps people who are living with mental health challenges. Pray about those people and for those people and with those people and after you've seen those people. So prayer is critical there. In a chaplaincy world, presence has some specific connotations, but the simple version of presence is just turn up. It's about relationship. Now, yes, you can have relationship over the phone and over Zoom and all those, and we've got some wonderful technology today. But by and large, most of the people we have relationship with, we see face to face on a pretty regular basis. That's presence. And then pastoral care. And again, I'm aware that some people hear pastoral care and think, well, that's okay for you chaplains, you pastoral people. I'm always a little bit hesitant. I don't know what to say or what. Again, 3 is a good number, but I think informally, and that just means when you're engaging with someone and someone gives you an opportunity to talk about where faith is in your life. And the classic one there is, so what did you do on the weekend? Oh, I was at church. That's not rocket science. What are you looking forward to this week? Oh, I'm looking forward to Bible study on Tuesday night. Oh, what are you listening to? Or I'm listening to, pick your Christian
Anxious
singer.
Faith.
I don't know enough to be helpful. I want to say Amazing Grace, but I'm probably not trendy anymore if I ever was. So informally, formally. So having the relationship and saying, oh, look, we're running an alpha course at church, or we've got Christmas coming up, and if you can't take the opportunities to overtly share Jesus and to have structures that support that. And then there's a whole pile of stuff in the creativity space. So we've got St. Patrick's Day coming up. A normal St. Patrick's Day, and again, normal doesn't quite exist in aged care, would be St. Patrick's Day. So I'll wear something loud and green, primarily so people can laugh at me and just, oh, he's actually a human. He's not some super spiritual, ooh, he's the chaplain. Doesn't really suit me anyway. But wear green, we'll get people together. I've got an activity sheet which will have some stuff, Irish hymn, of course, St. Patrick's Day. We'll have some green food. If I can manage it, we'll have some Guinness tasting, either that or green beer, one of the two. So just some fun and games, but then also talked about the story about St. Patrick. Kidnapped as a child, taken as a slave to Ireland, escapes back to England, comes to faith, and then chooses to go back to Ireland as a missionary. If you can't sort of fit Jesus into that conversation, I think you've probably got a problem.
Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. What about for, if the people that we don't necessarily throughout our routine have presence with already, say we've decided to actually go and there is, a family member who is living in aged care or a care home. There is this person from my church that I used to see in the congregation who is no longer there. I used to chat with them when they were at church, so I'm going to go and visit them now. What can people be doing in those kind of spaces when they're actually going into, someone's care home room and spending some time with them to help ease some of that burden of loneliness and mental anguish they might be going through?
Yep. So in terms of one-to-one stuff, the first thing is praying again, that prayer, presence and pastoral care. So I think we're sort of in the pastoral care space. We've prayed for them. We've turned up where we're there with them.
Yeah.
Again, just engage with them and find out and listen. From there, it will depend on who the person is and where they're at. So I remember when I was at Bible college, there was a lady, she was Eastern European. I don't remember what variety of Eastern Europe. Her bed, she was legally blind. Looking back now, I'd say there was a fair amount of dementia there too. But her bed and area was covered in icons. Now, icons are not part of my Christian tradition. That's not my space. But I would go and sit with her and she called me father, which always messed with my head too. Um, but for her, hello, how are you? Oh, would you like me to read the Bible with you? She had a Bible on a bedside table, couldn't read it, couldn't access God's word. Um, and so simply sitting and reading with her was profoundly powerful. Uh, so it can be as simple as that. And we can do that too over the phone. It can be, oh, Gran, on a Tuesday night, can I call you and we read the Bible together? Lots of older people have someone who rings them every day. I did that when my grandmother was alive. I would call most days. Now, sometimes those were deep and meaningful conversations. A lot of them were pretty low grade. Hello, how are you? What's happening in your world? How can I care for you? I guess the other thing that's particularly helpful if we're visiting is I offer to pray. And again, I do say offer because older people are people and they should get a choice in that. And I know myself, there have been times where I'm not up to someone praying with me. But I would also add, it's an opportunity, and my standard practice is to say, well, what would you like me to pray for? Or what can we pray for? Now, the Lord's Prayer is a classic prayer there, and I use that regularly. Psalm 23, when we're dealing with someone who's dying, is really significant and useful. But often I'll have sat with someone who's been talking about incredible mental health challenges, and I'm thinking, oh, crumbs, or and they say, oh no, I want to pray for my grandson, Frank. He's just broken up with his girlfriend. It was first girlfriend, and he's really sad about it. So I think that's part of it, being flexible and being willing to deal with what the person wants to deal with. I guess the other thing that's helpful there is there will be times, particularly when you're dealing with someone who's dealing with mental health issues, where you need to refer, particularly around if someone says that they're suicidal. You'll need to do some stuff around there. Now, it's all the standard suicide prevention stuff, which I'm sure you guys have covered already on the show. But flagging with someone, not just, oh, that's sad, bye. So all that is really important, particularly in the mental health space, and particularly around the suicide space.
That's it. Like you said earlier, they are, men aged 75 and above here in Australia are the group most likely to die by suicide. So it's not something we take lightly at any stage of life. Ben, what I love what you've been saying is that it's nothing groundbreaking necessarily that we need to be doing. And a lot of the things you're saying is stuff that, I've heard so many people sitting across the table or across, an internet connection to me in an interview talking about how it was when someone finally offered to, hey, how can I pray for you? Or what would you like me to pray for? Or just coming and making the time to come and sit with them and intentionally being a presence that began to help them feel not so isolated, not so alone, feel a bit more supported in their mental health journey. And that's exactly the same for people that are in that later stage of life. As scary and intimidating it may be sometimes to go and visit them and be having those conversations in person, they need it just as much as anyone else. So, Ben, I really appreciate all that you've shared with us today. I love that you're passionate about this and encouraging people to be thinking about this. This has been huge encouragement for me. My dad's only, in the last 6 months moved into a care home. So the stuff we've talked about in this interview and in the pre-chat before has personally encouraged me in how I think about how I engage with him and how I can encourage him in his walk. So yeah, Ben, I appreciate your expertise and your experience and sharing that with us. Just before we wrap up though, we've talked individually about what we can be doing, but what about as a broader church? Say, my church congregation, I see those same people there every week and I see a smaller group of them during midweek as well. But what can we as a church be doing for these people that are so often forgotten?
Again, all the things that you'd be doing for anybody else is probably the short version of that.
Yeah.
The bigger perhaps with the caveat that the people who you are seeing every week are probably the, to use an ASD term, high function older people. Um, Many older people can't make church. For some, that can be as simple as I don't have a driver's license anymore.
Yeah.
Um, there's a whole pile of practical situations. Does your church have a ramp? Does it have wheelchair or walker accessible seating? What's the disabled toilets like? So there's some really primitive, for want of a better phrase, things that we often don't get right as churches in that space. I think the next step, other than that, and those things we should just, by now, we should, in Australia at least, we should have under our belt, and sadly we often don't, is what's happened. If I go through my church roll, if you still have a church roll or a church directory, how many people have dropped off that who might be older? What's going on for them? Is that a transport issue? Is that their spouse now has dementia and someone has to sit with them? So could you organise a roster where someone goes and sits with the spouse so they can actually get to church, so they can have some social connection? That's huge. Have they moved into a retirement village? Have they moved into an aged care facility? Are they facing issues, and they've been in and out of a mental health institution? Are we engaging there? So all of those things, I guess, on an individual basis are huge. There is a whole pile of literature now about how we can run church services that are older people, dementia-friendly stuff. And again, that's another whole episode and a half probably. But we can be doing that both in our local churches, but I mean, could we be doing something in the local care facility? But before we talk about any of those nuts and bolts things, I think the first question for us to ask is the same question we asked when we talked about ageism on an individual level, but perhaps it's a blunt question, but is my church ageist? And I think this is Ben's test, so it's not peer-reviewed or anything. But the question is, what percentage of our resources do we spend on people under 20, time, money, and what percentage do we spend on people over 80? Now, there may be a case for some church that's in a brand new subdivision and the subdivision is totally full of young families. But most churches, I would suggest, are in a space where, yes, there's schools that we'd love to run scripture or RI or RE, depending on which state you're in. There's also some nursing homes that we probably drive past on the way to that school or a respite centre. So it starts not with what can we do, but with should we do anything? And I think the biblical imperative is that these people are people who are loved by God. These people deserve our love because they're our neighbours. These people are our parents, whether that is directly biological or generationally our parents. Yes, they may be hidden. And there's lots of people who are dealing with mental health in later life who are in their own homes. And that's even harder again. That bloke you don't see, or there used to be an old lady there and the garden's really ratty now, so what's going on there? Again, lots of it, I can talk mechanics, but before we talk nuts and bolts, we've actually got to decide that these people are made in God's image, are loved by God, and the risk of being slightly blunt, if someone doesn't come to faith, and again, I'm not touching the Calvinism Armenian debate, but as a child or as a young person, then they've got early adulthood and mid adulthood. The average length of stay in residential care in Australia now is 18 months.
Mm.
So functionally, I bury my congregation every 2 years.
Wow.
We have a tendency to say aged care is God's waiting room, which is a phrase that I hate with a passion. But aged care is a time of life where life is expiring. And that also means, and that's part of, we think, and I mean we here in the literature, the literature says that older people are really, really interested in spirituality. Now, I don't mean spirituality in a Christian sense. I mean spirituality in a general sense, meaning, purpose, hope. But meaning, purpose, and hope, that sounds a lot like Jesus to me. This is not a demographic of people who are hard to the gospel. This is a demographic of people who are incredibly open to the gospel. Again, to push Jesus' words a little bit, the harvest fields are full. The harvesters are very few.
Yeah.
And can we care for? Can we love? Can we pray, be present, and provide pastoral care? Unequivocally.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Ben, thank you so much for sharing with us. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, James.
These people, the elderly for want of a better term, are people who are yearning for the simple point of connection and community that we know is such an important part of walking the mental health journey well. I hope this conversation has been an encouragement and given you something to think about. If you're struggling with your mental health, we'd really encourage you to reach out and speak to someone for help. That might be a friend, a family member, pastor, counsellor, or doctor. Or if you're not sure where to turn, on our website is a list of organisations that you can contact for help if you're in Australia and New Zealand. You can find it at anxiousfaith.org/helplines. The link is in the description. Now, Anxious Faith is more than just a podcast and these videos. On our website, you can find a whole range of content on our blog and resource pages, and we're adding new content all the time. You can also sign up to our mailing list or follow us on socials to be the first to hear when new episodes and blog posts come out. And we'd love for you especially to be on socials with us, where we're part of a growing community of fellow believers, encouraging one another and opening up about their personal struggles with mental health and faith. So to find out more of where to follow us, check the links in the description or head to the website anxiousfaith.org. Anxious Faith is a production of and a part of Our Daily Bread Ministries. Our heart is to see followers of Jesus spending more time in God's Word, engaging with it, and seeing how that can bring change to their faith and lives. If you want to find out more or want a way you can start spending time each day in the Bible, you can check out our flagship devotional, Our Daily Bread, or our other resources at odb.org. Links down there as well. And it's only through the support of people like you that we're able to produce this show and keep sharing resources. So if you'd like to support us, you can hit the donate button on our website, which will allow you to partner with us and help us to continue to produce more work for Anxious Faith. But thanks for listening, and we'll see you next episode.